Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are ready to begin. We'll start right away so that we can have as much opportunity for interactive discussion as possible. The first panel discussion of the afternoon is on the topic Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, the role and responsibilities of global governance institutions to contribute to world peace. I'm very happy to be joined by the panel by a number of the speakers who we've already had a chance to get to know. Minister Ögmundur Jónasson, Dr. Lovro Šturm, as well as Professor Mark Vlasic and Dr. Simon Adams. In addition, we're joined by two additional speakers who I will give the floor to first. First of all, I'm very happy to have a member of our advisory board here, Dr. Zvonimir Separovic, former Minister of Justice and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, amongst many other very important jobs in Croatia. So really someone who has also dealt with these issues of human rights in his actual job, as well as having many opportunities to reflect on these issues. So I'm very happy to have Professor Separovic here. In addition, I'm very happy to have Professor Jernej Letnar Černič, who is a professor of human rights law, School for European and Government Studies, European Faculty of Law here in Slovenia. So I'm very happy also to welcome you here. I'd ask maybe us, before we begin the panel, to give a brief welcome to the two panelists who have just joined us. So Professor Černič and also His Excellency Dr. Paul Separovic. Could we please give a brief welcome to them? And I'm very pleased, actually, that Dr. Separovic has agreed to begin the panel discussion with a very brief presentation. So it should be ideally between 5 or 10 minutes, just to get the ball rolling on this issue of actually genocide, mass atrocities, and in particular, what is the role and what is the responsibility for global governance? So, Dr. Separovic, if you could please begin with a brief presentation to then launch the multilateral discussion. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm happy about it. I have very strong connection to this city, to Ljubljana. I was promoted to doctor of the University of Ljubljana at the law school 30 years ago, so I feel at home in a way. And it is so good that Slovenian government, together with the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, have organized this in Slovenia, which has been once part of Yugoslavia, which is now a member of the European Union, and this is a good spot, good place to talk about these problems. What we have been told by Professor Šturm, it was very striking for me because I have strong remembrance of the past, of the crimes at the end of the Second World War, where close to 200,000 people from Croatia have been killed here by partisans, many Germans, many Slovenians, many others. Terrible crime have been committed, and we have been told about the mass graves. And both of us, Professor Šturm and myself, have been reviewing the text and the book of one fine professor, Professor Mitja Ferenc, who was writing on hidden graves, prikrivena grobišća. We wrote also, both of us, separate preface for that book. It is a striking book on terrible crime. Then I like what we have been told here on the end of Yugoslavia and what happened in some regions with special stress on Bosnia, on Srebrenica. It was very striking what we have seen here by Mark Vlasic. What I would like to add is, besides Srebrenica and before Srebrenica, there was Vukovar, there was Ovčara with the hundreds, much less than at Srebrenica, but it was first crime of genocide against humanity, mass atrocity by Serbs in Vukovar at a place called Ovčara, with all those who have been in the hospital brought there, killed overnight. And it's only I said only 2,250, but there had been another 5,000 altogether in that city. There was no reaction in the world, not proper one, not a proper time. There had been some people like Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, so she has been named. She reacted, she said, someone might say that there is no such a thing as a killing in cold blood. If someone is thinking that way, should go to Vukovar to see what happened there. So just to remember those victims and happenings, I'm mentioning it here. In my presentation, I wanted to say and to propose two things. One is Security Council didn't react properly, not in time, it failed in the case of Syria and in many other cases, in Srebrenica and Vukovar definitely. So what we need actually is a changing political will, political structure of this world, which is all but perfect, as we have been told by someone this very morning. So what we need is to think about to change at least procedure at the Security Council. Security Council is a very important part of that organization. And what we need is to improve credibility of United Nations. That's why I would like to suggest that in the conclusions of this conference, this summit, should be mentioned that reform of the Security Council is absolutely needed. It's not easy to achieve. We cannot get rid of veto, but we can and have to enlarge to permanent members, and United States of America has already proposed India is to be the member. There are other proposals like Germany, Brazil, Japan, countries that deserve, according to the population and the strength they have in economy and in the world, they should be there equal to the others 5 who started it after World War II. My second presentation proposal is I'm supporting the idea of revising, reforming, changing Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide. In this respect, I support fully the initiative done by the ICD Academy and led by Prime Minister of Slovenia, good friend of mine, Janez. This is something what we are doing in the Institute coming from Berlin, but encompassing having people from all over the world and having a very, very important role in bringing people together to think about this world to be organized better, with special regard to prevent crimes of genocide and other atrocities that is needed, that is possible. So with those two proposals, I am saying also thank you to Mark for running as a founder and director of the Institute and Academy for Cultural Diplomacy, and Janez for his initiative up to the United Nations General Assembly last September, I believe it was it. And this is something what is taking place, what is worthwhile to do. And in older Athens, people used to say, those who are not standing up for the public interest, they are useless people. Mark Donfried and Janscha and people from the Cultural Institute are not useless. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Separovic, also for those very warm words of support. Very, very grateful. What I'd like to do to begin the multilateral discussion today is to maybe ask also the second speaker, who has not yet had a chance to speak yet, to maybe respond to the title of this panel discussion. As we look at this title, Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities, I would ask you, Professor Černič, what role do you see and what responsibilities do you see for global governance institutions? What contribution can they make towards actually world peace?
Thank you very much. Thank you for invitation. Lep pozdrav vsem skupaj. My presentation will basically be in two parts, and I'll try to be brief. And in the first part, I'll just give you some context in the Slovenia situation and why Slovenia is a good place to talk about genocide and prevention of genocide. And then the second part, I'll talk about the nature of obligations which international organizations and also their members, states, have to prevent genocide. Now, as you know, unfortunately, Slovenia is a good place to talk about genocide. And why is that? Over 600 mass grave sites which were found in the last years portraying the genocide or the crimes against humanity which were committed after the Second War in Slovenia. And then also impunity. You know, nobody was held accountable for those crimes committed. Earlier this year, I had a chance to visit Cave of Evil, Huda Jama, near Laško, close to the village Rečica in Slovenia, and it was quite striking experience for me. Actually, I was quite stumbled for the many days to come after my visit. And what one can see in the cave is just extraordinary, and it basically is going against the conscience of the humanity. One would not deserve even one's harshest enemy to end like this, in the cave, in the small hole in the cave near Laško in Rečica. Almost 3,000 persons have been killed there. And of course, at the time when those crimes were committed, international organizations have not been established yet. United Nations organization was in making. Universal Declaration of Human Rights was 3 years from being adopted. So at the time, one would wish that we would have a policy or a normative framework as we have it right now on the responsibility to protect. Now, coming back to the obligations of international organizations, we have to say two things. First, international organizations are subject to international law. So they have international obligations to respect human rights and humanitarian law in their operations. We are aware of numerous cases where international organizations have been allegedly violating human rights, especially when conducting peacekeeping operations. Secondly, of course, international organizations are only organizations made up of states. So when the states become a member of a national organization, they don't relinquish their responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And one has to ask oneself, what is the nature of the obligations states and international organizations have? Well, I would argue on the basis of human rights doctrine and also recently adopted Maastricht's principles on extraterritorial obligations of states in the field of economic and social rights, that states, but also international organizations, have obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. And if you allow me just briefly to explain what the nature of those obligations would mean. Obligation to respect of states and also international organizations would mean that states and international organizations have to avoid doing harm. No, they have to stay by the side when they have opportunity to interfere with human rights obligations. No? Secondly, obligation to protect. International organizations and states have obligations to ensure and adopt and enforce measures that human rights will not be violated across the world. We all know that international human rights documents say that human rights are universal, interdependent, inviolable, and so on. But we also know that some governments would object to this definition, and they would say that human rights are not universal. But then, if you ask people in Hanoi, or in Damascus, or in Kinshasa, whether they want to have human rights or not, they would, in sync, reply, yes, we would like to have human rights. You know? So this objection of culturalism doesn't apply to this respect. So every state would have obligation to adopt and enforce measures to prevent genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, if it's in its power to do so. And especially if it has a de facto control over the area where human rights violations are taking place. And third obligation, or pillar of the type obligation, is obligation to protect, which states that international organizations and states have to do everything in their power to cooperate between each other to prevent future human rights violations and crimes against humanity and genocides. In this context, where this initiative comes in and basically provides for a normative and policy framework for international community to prevent human rights violations, being in Slovenia or being in Syria. Just lastly, to conclude and coming back to my initial words, I would say if such an initiative or a framework on the responsibility to protect would exist at the time of cave of evil, maybe such events wouldn't have occurred. And that's why I think it's in our interest as a human beings to support any initiatives in this respect, regardless of our contemporary political positions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since we've now had a chance to hear already from each of the speakers throughout the morning, I think now would be a good time to try to actually correct one of the flaws of this conference, namely the gender balance. Even though we have a wonderful group of speakers, so I'm very grateful to have here, we did actually fail when it came to the gender balance. We were actually supposed to have a few female speakers, and in the end they couldn't come. Therefore, what I'd like to do now is give first priority to the women in the audience to ask a question or also give feedback. We haven't really given you a chance so far today. I very much hope that you all came today really to be active participants. These are your speakers, and I think I'd be very curious just to hear, what are the questions that you have, what is the feedback that you have on any of these issues. I'd love to first give the floor to any women here who would like to pose a question or give feedback. Secondly, then of course also to the men, and then I know also some of the speakers have also prepared also a few slides and a few other things too, but let's really make this as interactive as possible, and I'd ask you to please raise your hand if you'd like to make a contribution. And as always, briefly introduce yourself so that we can begin to get to know the diversity that's here. So I see there's one male candidate already raising his hand, but is there first a woman or a female here who would like to participate? Just to help, as I said, the gender balance. I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but are there any ladies here? Or? Yes, excellent. All right. Okay, so we have one courageous voice here in the middle. If you could please briefly introduce yourself, and then also if your question is directed to somebody in particular, please let them know as well. Please.
Yeah, now it is, okay. Well, Vasilka Sensin from the Faculty of Law, University of Ljubljana. I'm actually very pleased that this conference is taking place in Ljubljana as well. And the reason for that is that Slovenia has been involved in the whole development of the concept of responsibility to protect. As we know, our former president, Milan Kučan, spoke about it already in the year of 2000 before the United Nations, as well as his successors. Slovenia has been instrumental in facilitating the adoption of the relevant paragraphs of the World Summit outcome document in 2005. Ambassador Kirn was there, facilitating the adoption of the paragraphs 138 and 139. And Slovenia has all the way through been involved in all the groups supporting the operationalization of the concept. And now I'm really happy that we have also nominated the focal point for R2P. Now I have a question addressed to all the panelists, and this is, what do you see could be a very concrete contribution of Slovenia in light of the initiative that was presented in the last General Assembly session by our Prime Minister, as well as the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy? So what concrete measures could be promoted by Slovenia in light of her capacity as a, let's say, smaller, one of the smallest states? What concrete measures, and what exactly is meant by upgrading the Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide? Are there concrete ideas of opening the text of the Convention? We heard today about the possibility of adopting an optional protocol to the Convention. Are there any other concrete suggestions of how Slovenia should move the concept forward? So that would be my question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I would give the floor to any one of the panelists who would like to give an initial response. And as you know, this will go straight to the Prime Minister. So this is your chance to give some advice also to what Slovenia can do. Who would like to respond?
Dr. Šturm, maybe.
Doctor? Yeah? Okay, we'll start on the left and we'll come to the right. Dr. Adams.
Thank you for that, and thanks for, first of all, for speaking when Mark had so clearly put an entire gender on notice that they needed to speak. I think your prognosis is absolutely correct in terms of Slovenia's role, and I think it has played an important role. As a small country, as you say, but I think as a country with a very clear and a very strong voice around these issues. So, for example, in New York, Slovenia still plays a very important role in the group of Friends of R2P, which is a grouping of member states who support the responsibility to protect. It's been very good in the General Assembly, as you've noted, not just in 2005, but all the way through. And as somebody whose day job is basically working with UN member states at the UN, Slovenia would be on our short list of countries whenever an issue comes up that we want to talk to member states about R2P or something that we want to do advocacy around, and we're looking for states to champion that. It's always on that short list of states that we would go to, and I think that's a very good thing. I think the type of country it is enormously important for why its voice is taken seriously in the way that it is, in that all too often in these debates, particularly around a specific situation which is deadlocked in the Security Council or around which there's division inside the General Assembly, it tends to polarize around blocks, big powerful countries pushing against each other. And the fact that Slovenia comes from the particular kind of history that it has and comes from the particular region that it is, I think means that it's seen as somehow being independent of that, or as removed from that. It's not seen as being a country that has a vested national interest or a partisan interest in any of these issues. It's seen as being, if you like, an honest broker around the issues where mass atrocity crimes are concerned. In terms of what it can do next, I mean, obviously we heard this morning from the Prime Minister and about this issue of an optional protocol, and a few of us had an opportunity to meet with him, I think, on one-to-one meetings, and this is certainly something that he's very keen in advancing. I think it's certainly an issue that needs to be explored further, but as I said to the Prime Minister this morning, and I think certainly my view very strongly is that this We can never look at legal mechanisms in separation from the more general political thrust. As I said in my talk, it's political will, which is fundamentally the issue in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and more generally in international politics. So if we can couple this notion of an optional protocol with a broader campaign around advancing the responsibility to protect, then I think that would be a positive thing. And I think Slovenia is in a good position to do that.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you, again, Slovenia and the government and our host for having us. I think for me, it's great to be here because in many ways, my interaction with kind of genocide and at such a high level, and particularly with political individuals responsible for such mass atrocities, in many ways brings me back to Slovenia. When I was a very junior prosecutor at the War Crimes Tribunal, I worked on the Slobodan Milosevic case, and one of the duties I was assigned was reaching out to the then President Milan Kucan and also then the Prime Minister Denošek and interviewing them and asking in the case of President Kucan to come to the tribunal and testify. And I have to say that I think for many people when they're asked to come to the tribunal, this is not something they necessarily look forward to and excited to do, particularly if they're going to be facing off with Mr. Milosevic. Because for many people who watched the trial, Milosevic was not so nice. He often insulted people and was not very, very caring to their feelings, and indeed was damaging to some people's reputations. And so I think the fact that President Kucan decided to accept our invitation to come and to stand for all of humanity to describe what had happened, his experience with Mr. Milosevic was a courageous thing to do. And indeed, we asked some individuals to come to the tribunal to testify, and they declined. And some people hid behind their immunities and said, I'm sorry, I'd like to come, but I'm immune and I don't have to come. And I think these people are cowards. And I think when we look at the crimes that were perpetrated, so many people risked their lives to come to the tribunal to testify, people, particularly crime-based witnesses, who still live in a region which is very dangerous in some cases, and there are small towns and hamlets where people could quite easily figure out who they were and go after them or their families. And so for all those who came forward, I think should be recognized as being courageous individuals, because it's the case far too often when mass atrocities happen, many people just sit back and watch. And the fact that people are willing to step forward and put themselves and their reputations on the line to speak for justice, I think is a compliment. So Slovenia, I think, stands proud in that respect. When it comes to kind of a direct outcome, one of the things that was mentioned was looking to kind of the US model of the Atrocities Prevention Board. And I think this is a very worthwhile endeavor. And I think one of the things being discussed here is how to work with civil society for these atrocity prevention boards. I think one of the things that you have happen is if you have a board which is only comprised of people of government without any outside advisors or NGO folks, I think oftentimes where people sit depends on where they stand. And I think being able to have some sort of advisory board, perhaps if Slovenia wanted to propose something with the European Union and trying to figure out a way to work with members of civil society for NGOs. Obviously, you can't have every NGO on a board, but you could find a middle ground perhaps, inviting notable scholars and luminaries who are members of very established organizations. And I can think of a couple people who have tremendous reputations as either former prosecutors or other kind of senior judges who are affiliated with large organizations. You could have them in their individual capacities serving on these boards so they could speak from their experience. And I think this would be a concrete outcome that Slovenia could propose or work with other colleagues to see if there's some way to move this issue forward. So thank you. Hvala lepa.
Thank you very much. Minister Jónasson?
Yes, I think the initiative Slovenia is taking in the international arena and by organizing a conference like this one here has a value in itself. Dr. Simon Adams said earlier that we were winning the war of ideas. Now, the winning idea is the responsibility of protection. Now, the problem with this winning idea is that it is a norm. It is not codified in law, and I think this is the task tried to codify this in international law in order to undermine the importance of the Security Council, because the problem there is the veto power of the superpowers. It has become, this veto power has become an obstacle to international efforts to address and solve problems, atrocities that we are witnessing now in Syria. What do I mean by this? I mean that we somehow must work for decisions at the United Nations becoming automatic, based in international law, where we have codified what now is the norm of responsibility or protection. I think this is the task. We cannot easily get away with the Security Council and the superpowers there, but we can undermine their influence and their power in the world. What does America say to that?
Thank you very much, Minister. Other responses in terms of the role that Slovenia should have or could have? Yeah, please.
The point you raised, Vasilka, it's quite a valid one. I mean, it's very questionable what would be the right way to go forward on this issue. But it's in a way connected with the whole future responsibility to protect. No? We all know that the concept is now stands a policy framework. It's not a normative framework, and this would be one of the ways how to put it into the law. But if you allow me just one observation, why this initiative is also important for Slovenia. It's important from the credibility point of view, from both externally and internally. You know, this initiative is one of the initiatives which Slovenia wants to put itself on the image of the world, together with the attempts to join Slovenia into the European framework or platform for conscience regarding the crimes which were committed in the former totalitarian regime. But also internally, no? We shouldn't forget that those crimes which were committed on the Slovenian territory were not punished. Nobody was held responsible for that. Our children and people who go to the secondary school do not study those crimes committed. So this initiative has to go hand in hand together with the internal commitment to talk about the crimes which were committed in Slovenia after the Second World War, and to promote this initiative abroad. Without both, without internal and external dimension, Slovenia will not be really credible in the eyes of the world.
This is from the panel, or? Oh yes, please, Dr. Šturm.
Ja, hvala lepa.
Thank you for the floor. The question was very well put. And the lively discussion so far has shown what a pertinent issue this norm is. But I understood this question to be too formalistic. What procedures should follow? Shall we sign a protocol to the convention or what? I believe that this issue deserves our attention, but in terms of content and bearing in mind the historical retrospective. We have to bear in mind that when it comes to mass atrocities, to genocide, to all these crimes, all that represents the encroachment of law, of natural law. It is against the principles of civilization, of civilized peoples. The convention was adopted, and as such, it enables us easier legal classification. But when the Nuremberg court was taking decisions on these crimes, and there was also a Nuremberg resolution, for the fairness of trial, other circumstances had to be provided, and that is the establishment of the criminal intent of perpetrators, the establishment of the plan for the criminal offense, and the proof of the existence of a criminal society or conspiracy. But that that was about the year 1993, and the then criminal group of National Socialists or Nazis, and the plan for the criminal offense was proven by way of testimony and acts taken. But I think we should also carry out research and write studies about the crimes which took place after the Second World War, including those in Slovenia. A parallel can be drawn in this context, and that could be applicable to similar cases. The criminal intent was expressed in mass killings which took place in Slovenian territories, because there were not individual separate cases or incidents. It was proven that this was a systematic action based on a criminal plan, and the criminal group which organized that plan and carried it out is known in Slovenia. That was the then leadership of the Communist Party, the establishment in the times of Titoism, which generated such acts. So such analyses are extremely useful, also in for the basis for our as a basis for our future orientation. Now, according to the convention, the existence of a criminal group has no longer needs to be established, but it can be an aggravating circumstance, and the criminal intent in itself is sufficient in the terms of convention, and in this sense. Prosecution is made easier by the convention, but the basic convention of the prosecution remained the same, unaltered over the last 100 years. As long as we understand that the natural law principles which go way back to the late Middle Age scholastics are actually the basis for our understanding and our knowledge of this area. So in what way to proceed? Formally, it is certainly correct to speak about improving the procedure, about the codifying the norms into the national law. But that in itself is not enough. Each individual state and all states collectively should do more to discuss this theme broadly, to carry out a very precise analysis to cover not only 20 years of the past, but at least 100 years of the past, to examine what happened, to evaluate what happened in a correct way, and to convey that message, that evaluation, to the general public and to the expert public, not just the legal public, but also in the education system, in schools. These are things which should be spoken about openly and labeled as they are, also in the education system. This is, of course, extremely important for the future preemptive measures, and it is also of essential importance for a completely another reason which has not been mentioned today yet. All such mass atrocity leave long-term conscious or subconscious consequences not only at the individual level but at the level of the entire nation. In many cases, this only deepens the differences of opinion and controversies between people. So therefore, it is very important to speak about these issues openly, without any kind of hiding, and trying to achieve reconciliation in this area in a tolerant way. This is a long-term obligation which has to be met, because no human society can achieve, attain a bright vision of the future without coming to a common denominator in these matters, which then leads to the final national reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Šturm. What I would suggest we do now is take one more question from the audience, maybe actually two more questions. Then I know, Professor Vlasic, you've also prepared a few slides as well, so we'll kind of go back and forth. But please, you've been waiting. And if you could please introduce yourself as well. Microphone? Or? My colleague will help you. Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Rand. I am president of the Slovenian Committee for NATO. I appreciated very much the contributions of all the panelists and the previous speakers. All the contributions were prodigious and brought to me a lot of new ideas. Here I would like to draw your attention first to the education, and second, the role of mass media in the prevention of the criminal acts against the humanity. We in Slovenia, we have experience as well as in Yugoslavia, and we can see that the actual perpetrators were our neighbors, here or in Bosnia, ordinary people which we met in the street. And I think that the protective layer in each human of the humanity is very thin. And in certain circumstances, this shell of humanity breaks and the devil comes out. The medicine against this is the education. Historical textbooks, it's very important, as well as the values. The values should be brought to the young generation, not only to the scholars. And second, here in education has also a role mass media. Mass media can have a very detrimental effect on the population. Demonization of the political opponents, segregation of the political society, of a cultural society, is very, very obnoxious. And we have also to speak about the role of media and how to persuade media that to overcome the cleft between one side and the other side should be eliminated. So I think future action, both here in this country, in Slovenia, as well as in the international community, is to put forward more efforts into education and mass media. And now back to the Security Council. Of course, this is veto right of superpowers is very detrimental. But we should not be too optimistic. This will stay. But what we can do is the condemnation of the veto in the case which can lead to the genocide or any criminal acts against the humanity. Condemnation of the political community, international community, social society, as was suggested by our Prime Minister 3 hours ago. So I think this is feasible and can be done with the majority of political parties or members of the United Nations General Assembly, or even independent political international institutions. Condemnation which brings responsibility to those who decide for the veto. So I would appreciate if you could comment my ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Who would like to respond first? Please.
I simply want to wholeheartedly agree with you on this, proposal of condemnation, but I also agree with what you said about education, and Dr. Šturm also emphasized this in his talk. I think Mark Vlasic's lecture should be in every classroom in the world, because we must remember that these things, these atrocities, history shows us that they can happen everywhere. And I think this was a very powerful lecture you gave. Not only the photographs and what you were telling us about, what shocked me most was the text you showed us with the orders, the primitive cold-bloodedness, or should I rather say, the sophistication, no doubt all in correct grammar, ordering people to kill others or make life terrible for them. So I want to agree with you and Dr. Šturm on the importance of education.
Not so much on the issue of condemnation, but maybe on this issue of the media and memory as well. And I think memory is incredibly important. And I think anybody who works in this area talks about it as one of the key things. And I mean, I don't think I'm the oldest person in the room, but I'm certainly not the youngest either. And you know, in my own lifetime, I remember being a child at elementary school and a Jewish school teacher bringing in a relative who had been an inmate at Auschwitz. And she made every class member line up in a nice row and walk up to the front and touch the tattoo on her arm. This is the survivor who did this, not the teacher. And she said, someday people will tell you that this never happened and that you never saw this. I want you to actually look at it on my arm and I want you to feel it. And so she not just told her story, she also wanted people to have a physical experience of it. And as a child, I thought that was well, first of all, I thought it was a bit crazy. But secondly, I never thought in my lifetime that we would see, you know, in my lifetime, that we would see neo-Nazis back on the streets of places like Germany, that we would see people denying the Holocaust, not just saying that it was a good thing, but denying its mere existence, even in my own lifetime. So memory is enormously important, and I think that's where the media can actually play a role. I think it's a double-edged sword. I'm somebody who also has done a lot of work, you know, writing in the media and things like that and trying to bring attention to particular cases. And I think we shouldn't give up generationally. I think there's a tendency for every generation to look down on the generation that comes after them in terms of their commitment to issues and so forth. I'm part of the Generation X, and certainly we copped it badly a few years ago, but now we look down with some sense of smug superiority on the iPod generation, as they're called, or Generation Y, who come behind us. But you know, I think the issues are still resonate with people, and I think new media is enormously important in this area as well, and I think that's something we should never forget. The organization Invisible Children is not an organization, we have some major kind of differences with them on policy, but they made a video, you know, last year, the Stop Coney video, which was seen by 100 million people in a period of 2 weeks. And even though I disagreed with some aspects of the video, and as I said, as organizations, we have some differences regarding strategy and so forth, something I will continually give them credit for was, you know, somebody like me walking around the streets of New York, and then people would suddenly say, hey, what do you think about that Joseph Kony thing? People who had never heard of the Central African Republic, didn't know it was a country. People who hadn't heard of, maybe had heard of Uganda, but had no idea who the Lord's Resistance Army were suddenly talking about Joseph Kony and so forth, and about the need to bring him to justice and bring him to the ICC. So I think, these things the media can be used in a very positive way as well. And I think, there is a reservoir of people out there, regardless of generation, who care about these issues and who still desperately think we need to learn from our past.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Close to the education, which is important, I agree fully with you, is the science, research. Some historians have been blamed by politicians who would like to forget the past, like leftists, communists, and the others, suggesting, well, what are you doing? You are digging the graves to prove something, to change the history, and so on. It's rather strange. Science, both legal science, social sciences, other historians, should work on the truth. What actually happened? We have been told today here about the Bleiburg and years after 1945 and so on. It is something that must be, for many reasons, brought to the public to be known, also to make it possible for the children to learn about it, not in the brutal way, not to give them Marx PowerPoint presentation immediately in the early school years and so on, but at the proper time, in the proper way. So the history is something what must not be just smashed and thrown away. It is something what is speaking for the future. Let's not have it again. No more, never again, nunca más. No more the world without genocide. It is a sentence that has been produced by us here. So it is important that in order to find what and how happened, to try to find the truth and then to publish it, to make it present, visible, transparent, not to insist on it. These who are blaming us for looking for the past and victims and the others, they are saying it's better to look in the future, not in the past. But it's both. History is the teaching the people. It is something what is needed. It's not basic, it's not the only one, but it is important. It is about truth. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw another hand way off to the side. If you could please briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll come to the middle.
Добре. Ana Alibekova, University of Bologna. First of all, thank you for the organization of this important event. It's my pleasure to be here and to hear all of you talking on this topic. I guess the aim of this conference is also how to contribute to long-term reconciliation, not just to stop the conflict immediately, but how to provide durable peace. In that sense, I would like to ask you how we can move from this concept of responsibility to protect to a concept called long-term reconciliation. What I want to say is how from this more or less, let me say, vague concepts that we talk about and more dramatic narratives about genocide, how to come to the local needs of the people. To what extent the international community takes into consideration the local needs of the people, and in that sense, what are the lessons learned from conflicts in Yugoslavia, which was the biggest international laboratory for conflict management, lessons from Libya, lessons from Rwanda. Did the international community learn how to take into consideration the needs of the local people, not only the NGO sector. Thank you. In first place, the question is addressed to Professor Vlasic.
Thank you very much. I think that when it comes to these institutions, particularly the war crimes institutions, they're challenging because many people look to international justice, and I think some may think that just the fact that you have prosecutions fixes everything, and it doesn't. Particularly for the ad hoc tribunals, we are charged with prosecuting those most responsible for the crimes. And the challenge for myself when I was serving there is I spent a lot of time talking to crime-based witnesses, people who saw their entire families slaughtered before their eyes, and I was recruiting them to be a witness against either Mr. Milosevic or General Krstic or some other senior general, when frankly they had very little interaction, probably if any, like zero, with Mr. Milosevic. And they know the neighbors in their community who killed their families and maybe raped or abused or tortured them. And their question to us was, why am I working, why are we going to this trial for Mr. Milosevic when the guy who killed my family still lives next door? What are you doing about him? And this is, I think, a huge challenge for the international community because the tribunals that we have are not set up to trial every single person who pulled a trigger. And one of the goals of the tribunal, of the case of the Yugoslav tribunal, is try to work with the local countries in this region and to try to increase their justice sector. And we have judges here that are actively participating in this, working with the countries to try to raise the level of expertise to try to prosecute these cases locally. And so I think one of the big challenges when one looks at resources, because there's not money for everything, is how do you make the balance between prosecuting very high-level individuals, but also trying to deal with people on the street who still walk around every day. And also, I think this is something, we have someone from South Africa, what's the experience of other countries with truth and reconciliation commissions? Because oftentimes, if you can't prosecute everyone, what is the way of getting to the truth? And oftentimes, maybe a way of trying to solve people's concerns is not by having the adversarial system we have at the international tribunals that I'm familiar with, but having some way of discussing the matter and bringing it out. And so I'd love to hear from my colleague in terms of South Africa's experience, and also in Rwanda, where we have someone here that's been active in Rwanda with the judge, and perhaps we could hear more about what Rwanda is doing, because in Rwanda, in many cases, you were either a victim or a perpetrator. There wasn't much time between the two in many communities.
Dr. Adams, would you like to respond?
Sure. Look, I think within R2P, there's obviously, if you look at the R2P and the way it was developed, there was this sense that there were three aspects to it. This is way before it even became codified at the UN, which was there was a responsibility to prevent, obviously. There was a responsibility to respond when things were happening. But the third element, I think, is the element which is often forgot, which was there was a responsibility to rebuild afterwards in societies that have gone through mass atrocity crime situations. And I think that's in complete accordance with and in keeping with the reconciliation agenda. And I think, we've seen that in some specific instances. I was asked the question about South Africa. My family come from Northern Ireland, and I've lived and worked in South Africa. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a former member of the African National Congress. So we did go through a reconciliation process in South Africa, and we've actually gone through one in Northern Ireland as well. And so even in my own life and in my own family, I've seen how these issues can be bitterly divided. My aunt was murdered in 1972 by state agents, and her case was one of the cases at the Reconciliation Commission, and I saw how deeply it divided my own family in a way that I never expected it to. Somebody came forward with information and applied for amnesty, and I never expected it would divide my family as deeply as it did. So I've actually had to struggle with those issues in a very personal way as well. What's the relationship between peace and justice? Is it a trade-off between one and the other? Must you choose? Must you have peace or justice? Or is there a way of fusing the two? And I think the the lessons of and obviously South Africa and Northern Ireland weren't mass atrocity situations, but they have related experiences in terms of the struggle for reconciliation. And in my experience, and I also have done a little bit of work in Rwanda, as I mentioned before, and and had an opportunity to visit a number of the Gacaca court system, the informal courts in Rwanda when they were still in session. They've ended now, of course. But in my experience, there is a strong relationship between accountability, or let me put it another way, accountability, breaking impunity, and reconciliation are not counterposed. It's not a question of choosing one makes the other not possible. We've got to find ways, they're actually related, and we've got to find ways of having convergence within them. And I think those are precisely the issues that people are still struggling with in somewhere like Rwanda. And it has to be said, honestly, that when you go there, I mean, Rwanda has taken enormous steps forward. But that nobody pretends for a second that there aren't tremendous underlying issues of unresolved between people in Rwanda. And I think another really interesting model to contemplate is actually in Côte d'Ivoire, because they're just starting to struggle with this now. They've set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They're trying to deal with, first of all, the civil war they had, and then, of course, the situation of mass atrocities they had last year. And they're going through precisely this same process and these same questions. They're actually actively looking around the world and saying, where has it worked? Where has it not worked? Why did it work there? And how do we reconcile peace and justice within a single framework so that it's not just victors' justice, that we can actually rebuild our nation out of these tragedies. But I think it has to be said honestly, there are no simple answers to these questions, or certainly none that I know of that I can expound on in the next 5 seconds.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. Judge Schoenberg would like to add something.
Thank you. I wanted to strongly subscribe to what has been said by Dr. Separovic, in that truth is key. And the question was raised by Dr. Adams, what about the relationship between truth and peace? And my apologies that I repeat, you find in all religions of the world, and this is bringing us together, this famous triangle, that indeed there is no peace without justice and no justice without truth. But what about truth? For me, there had been 2 obstacles to coming as close as possible to the truth, knowing that there is never an absolute truth. First, for unknown reasons, we had both in Rwanda and on the territory of former Yugoslavia to work in a system, in an adversarial system, both countries are not acquainted with. And I don't know why it was necessary, because being acquainted with a civil law system where the judges indeed are entitled to go in depth into that what they think is relevant for the case, in coming closer to the truth, it was, and it still is, relatively difficult because, yeah, it was driven by the prosecution, with all due respect, and the defense, but we all know that, I would say, really unfortunate deals were made, and this was one of the obstacles to coming to the truth. And then, what we also have to learn, at the same time, when we have an international tribunal, immediately we need capacity building, as it was, for example, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think there is a real impressive work done in the state court in Sarajevo, and I really admire this wonderful person, the president of the court, Madame Kreso. And she should be honored for this, what she has done on the lower, so-called lower level. And this all brings in a big picture, but it's not yet the truth. Indeed, it's for historians, and I recently attended in Ann Arbor a conference of historians, and I had to admit the second obstacle for us as judges is that we have to obey the fundamental rules of criminal procedure, and this is, for example, in dubio pro reo, in doubt in favor of the accused. So even if, as neutral persons, we would come to a totally different solution, based on the evidence before us, and this limited evidence before us, we come to a different conclusion, whereas a real historian is not bound by these rules. And one final remark, and this is really very important for me myself, because I never found an answer to this. It has something to do with the adversarial system, but in civil law systems we are acquainted with the additional task to also find out during the proceedings the question of why. Why was a crime committed? What is the personal background of a person? It was mentioned several times that former neighbors killed each other. Nobody knows why. And I think, based on the excellent books of Hannah Arendt, stating that the evil is in all of us, we must be aware of this. And this should also be learned, and a lecture to be learned for the younger ones, that when we are in a concrete situation, all of us, we are able to commit these heinous crimes. And I deeply deplore that when some of us, the judges, wanted to go into details of this, it was forbidden by the majority of the judges in a plenary. Why? Because it was simply said, it's not for the judges to step into the shoes of the prosecutors. In our civil law system, it would be different. We would go into the details, and it's mandatory for coming to the appropriate sentence to know more about the background. And as I said, priests, high-ranking doctors, from one day to the other, they become mass murderers, genocidaires. And how is it possible? I think here also, apart from historians, we need additional research by people from other areas of the academia in supporting us in this fight. And this would also help as a kind of preventive measures, so that we can realize, okay, in such a scenario, it is possible that a crime be committed. And let us avoid this scenario to happen. I think that's also something that should be said in this context. Thank you that I got the floor again.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm seeing a number of hands in the audience, and I think Dr. Šturm also wanted to make a response. Please.
Ja, hvala lepa.
Thank you. Today I already spoke about the importance of the judgment of the court HCR of Kononon. Obviously, this became an important case for the international law when we discuss topics which are the subject matter of our discussions today. And there is another recent decision of the HCR, and that is the Katyn Forest decision. I will not go to the main ruling, but there was an emphasis very clearly expressed. Not only committed crimes or actions, but also their denial, undervaluing or silence about an act represents a qualified form of the encroachment of basic or fundamental human rights. Let me give you more concrete example, again going back to Slovenia and its neighborhood. It is, of course, crucial that we treat the cases which took place in the 1990s in the territories of the former Yugoslavia, including Srebrenica. But if a national university doesn't mention at all the cases after 1945, for example, in Slovenia, which are entirely comparable to what happened in Srebrenica, then we can conclude from that, according to the HCR ruling, that this is a certain form of the encroachment of fundamental human rights and freedoms. We can be very naive and not mention and believe that they don't have any idea at a national university that such things, such crimes happened. We can, but if they have knowledge of that, this is the conscious encroachment.
Yeah, then we'll come to the audience. Okay.
Just briefly, in my opinion, the choice between reconciliation and justice, it's a false one. One cannot go with each other without the other. And we can see this very clearly in the case of Slovenia, where we had a peaceful transition, a very soft transition from undemocratic to democratic regime, but where the society is damaged in the subconscious because those acts have not been prosecuted and nobody has been punished. And as has been said earlier, what is important in human rights education is a physical contact, as Simon said. And the thing to go forward is to teach our children, our pupils in our schools, what has happened in the territory of Slovenia. And also in this stage, now is the time to open the cave of evil for the public, so that we can bring young people there to see how horrible, heinous those crimes are, which were committed there. And the human rights, often in Slovenia, human rights violation is something, and other act is not human rights violation. You know? Human rights violations cannot be interpreted according to the ideological divisions in the society. A human rights violation is a human rights violation, whether being a crimes against humanity after the Second World War, or the acts which were committed against so-called terrorists after the independence of Slovenia. Both of those acts are human rights violations, you know. And once for all, and we have to accept that we shouldn't interpret human rights according to our ideological divisions, and we should put those events and those crimes which were committed in Slovenia in our school books and bring children there where those crimes were committed, to show them, to see them that this really happened. Otherwise, as Simon said, nobody will believe history teachers in 50 years that those crimes were ever committed. In Slovenia, all elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make sure that as many voices get heard as possible. So I would suggest let's take the final two questions from the audience, then we'll come back to the panel. And then to conclude, Professor Vlasic has prepared a few slides, actually, that I think might actually serve as a good way of concluding the panel. We could maybe do that at the end. But please, you've been waiting patiently. If you could introduce yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon to you. My name is Josef Oriško, and I, with my colleague Radana Štefekova, we came from Czechoslovakia to participate in this interesting summit. Thank you for invitation. We work for the East European Educational and Culture Center. We do trainings for peacekeepers. We run peacebuilding anthropology courses for public sector in the West African countries. Let me contribute shortly to this interesting discussion. I've spent 5 years within peacekeeping missions 2 years in Kosovo, 2 years on the border between Georgia and Chechen, Ingush, and Dagestan Republic of Russian Federation, and afterwards some time on the border between Liberia and Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. It's not that much time, 5 years, but it was much enough for me to observe, to think, and to learn. And I learned one thing. There is a huge gap between the field and the office. There is a huge gap between field workers and officials, researchers, and so on. And this gap may cause many problems, misunderstandings. This gap is a cause of double standards, double measures, double approaches. Let me mention Kosovo, let me mention Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and so on. In 2009, I participated in the peace conference in Stadtsteining, Austria. And I raised a question to the audience of, let's say, 50 participants. And my question was, has anyone ever of you faced or experienced the real conflict, war, violence? Has any of you ever carried a weapon? Because it's quite heavy to carry a weapon. It's more than 20 kilos. It's not so easy to run the hill and carry the weapon. So, and the only gentleman from Namibia raised his hand. So my point is, field workers should meet with researchers, with diplomats, with officials, to share their experience and to put theory and practical knowledge together and to work together to improve actually the whole approach of so-called peace building. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Speaking of someone who has carried a weapon, I'd like to give the final comments to my colleague Darnell, please. Is there a question? Maybe use the microphone, yeah.
Okay, yes. First of all, you're right. If you're in headquarters, that's one thing. If you're out there in the field carrying a weapon, that's another, quite another. I definitely unite with you on that. In terms of history, in the current situation, you know, human beings have an aversion to killing each other. That's been proven. Having said that, yes, there are people out here who commit crimes against humanity and atrocities, but there are also people out here who, witnessing that, stop it, attempt to stop it. I just wanted to comment on that. But I just want to put a couple of things in perspective. In America, we have 25% of the world's prison population. 25%. That's 200,000 whites, 600,000 Latinos, and 1.5 million black men in prison. In Germany, which is a country of about 82 to 85 million people, we have 80,000 people in prison. In America, we have 40,000 black women in prison, which represents 50% of the prison population in Germany. There's a movement in America, and the reason why I bring this up is there's a movement in America, and it has a slogan: mass incarceration plus silence equals genocide. Now, within the context of that, I think that issue should be, in the context of this forum here, I think that issue should be raised, because if we're going to have an effort, an endeavor to eradicate the crimes against humanity, and among them genocide, then we have to be impartial and unbiased in our application of what we stand for. Just to put it in perspective, I'm a Vietnam veteran. We lost 60,000 people in Vietnam. In America, every year, on average, 25,000 people die as a result of gun deaths. That's not including the people who are wounded. And if you talk about the people who are wounded and the gun deaths together, we're talking about a figure between 90,000 and 100,000 a year. America is a country, a society at war with itself. And I think that one needs to look at that situation. Why is that? Why? Someone mentioned that there were some casualties in one part of the conflict zone here in Croatia or in Slovenia or in Kosovo of 8,000 people being slaughtered, you know, which is, I denounce that, I condemn that 100%. There's no question about that. One death is one too many. But we seem to not to notice the horrific numbers, the bloodshed in one of the most highly developed countries technologically, so to speak, in the world. We just deny that. Every year, 100,000 people are either killed or injured by gun confrontations. Why is this? Why does this happen? Is this, in fact, a hallmark of genocide? Is the fact that we have 25% of the world's prison population? What does that? How does that speak to the question of genocide, as some people in America would maintain? Why is there this aversion to talking about all the problems that exist in all of these countries across the board without being myopic? And I'm not saying that this group is, because I applaud the efforts of this group. There's no question about it. This is a fledgling group. It's a new group. It's trying to forge a new path. And I'll do everything in my power to assist it in that effort. But I think that this group does not need to make the same mistake, perhaps, that other groups have made in not recognizing the plight of people in the United States and in other countries around the world. But specifically, because I'm from this country, the United States, this question also needs to be addressed, and we have to talk about genocide or the lack thereof in America also.
Thank you very much. I'd give the panel a chance to respond to both of those. Professor Separovic?
There was a question why some people are killing other people, why it happened. A human being is a potential for everything, for good and bad. Man can produce evil like the bee honey, and vice versa. The other things are happening with the good behavior. One of the elements for committing crime, such as it is the case of killing, on one side is education, but even education cannot save the person not to be killed, the killer, the murderer. But again, education might help people to, religion might help people not to do evil things. But it has been mentioned now, guns. Availability of weapons is making it easier. United States of America is having law, having right, citizens have the right to have a gun. It might be good, it might be bad. I don't think it's good, except when it is a military or what have you. One of the problems for the genocide is, in the cases of dictatorship and so on, and countries with not due respect for the human rights, is to have arms. Next discussion to this in prevention genocide or amount of genocide or atrocities is not to make it available to have so many arms at hand. Passing to act is well-developed discipline in criminology. By having gun at home, you might easily turn to it. I have been minister, and I was told that the war was around, and I was told, Minister, would you like to have a gun? You know, we are at war. I said, no, thank you. They wanted to give me a policeman staying at my home. I said, thank you very much. So I hate arms, and I believe that the arms, they are not to be blamed, but to have too easy access to the arms is one of the elements on passing to the act, like in the cases of genocide. So this was my reaction to this. Thank you.
Thank you. Other reactions? Yeah, okay, Dr. Adams.
Just very quickly, I think, you know, the Global Center that I work for, part of its brief is to apply the R2P lens to situations without prejudice or privilege. So, but in doing so, we constantly have to reflect on what that means, and we have to be very focused on the legal definitions of the crimes as they are encapsulated in the Rome Statute, and look at situations where they're either threatened or there's imminent risk of those crimes, or where those crimes are currently taking place. And that can sometimes mean that you bump into people in unfortunate ways. And I mean, I would just give as a very quick example of that the situation with Rwanda, who have been a very, very good country. They've come out of a genocide themselves. They've rebuilt their country. They've been very, very good on R2P at the UN, have been a leading voice internationally and a very important voice in Africa in support of the responsibility to protect. And now there's increasing evidence that they're heavily implicated in mass atrocity crimes via the M23 movement in the Kivus in the eastern Congo. The group of experts report, I think, is fairly convincing. Also a situation in Burma where there's a lot of pressure from people because of the reform situation to keep quiet about the situation in Burma, and we've been speaking about that for quite a while, and then now, just in the last fortnight, we've seen that situation really explode with the Rohingya Muslims. I think we've got to push against the tendency to apply the genocide label loosely, if we can. I think sometimes people can in some circumstances apply the genocide label when what they're really trying to say is this situation is really, really bad, or this is a very, very gross human rights violation. And that's, so we've got to be very, very careful about that. We try to stick to the strict legal definition. So, for example, at no point in the crimes in Syria over the last 18 months have we ever used the word genocide. I do not believe what's happening in Syria is a genocide. There are mass atrocity crimes. They fit the definition of crimes against humanity. They also fit the definition of war crimes given the current civil war, but it's not a genocide. Just very quickly on the issue of the relationship between the field and the office, I agree with you that there's often a disjuncture which needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed by all of us. And I think where these things work best is where there is a dynamic relationship between the one thing and the other, and I've seen that go both ways. So, for example, you know, one of our things, we put out a publication called the R2P Monitor, which is for policymakers and circulates with governments and the UN, but anybody can sign up for it, and I'd encourage anybody here to go to our website and sign up for it if you're interested in these issues. But you know, we would develop these analyses based on information we would get in New York, but then we always wanted to check it against people in the fields, and that's one of the things that's so important. So we develop these necessary actions, recommendations for policymakers, and then you'd be amazed sometimes when you talk to people in the field, and they'd say, the real issue for us in South Kivu, in the DRC at the moment, is not so much these big issues that you're talking about, but is actually spare parts for helicopters. Because we don't have spare parts and because no country will give us spare parts for the helicopters, we can't actually fulfill our mandate of civilian protection properly because we don't have enough working helicopters. So it can sometimes literally come down to nuts and bolts issues that people in New York don't necessarily know about. But I think the reverse is true as well, is that sometimes when you're in the field, and I've done some field work myself, you can be so focused by the situation immediately in front of you, directly in front of you in terms of the protection of this group of civilians or this particular crisis in this particular village that you're based in, whatever, that you can actually lose sight of the bigger picture, an analysis of larger developments, and a prognosis of threats that are emerging. So I think, yeah, there has to be a dynamic relationship between the two things. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. What I would suggest we do now, we're running about 15 minutes late. However, the final panel discussion is about half the size of this panel discussion. I know, Professor Vlasic, you prepared some slides that I think do fit in very well with this panel. So if everyone would agree, I'd say let's go maybe another 5 minutes. Perhaps you could show us those slides.
Start the next one after that.
Or would it fit in with the next one? Or? It's up to you. I would say, I think it's more relevant to this panel. I was like, if everyone agrees, I would suggest let's show those slides now. Maybe we could do that briefly for 5 minutes. Then we take maybe a somewhat shorter break, maybe 20 minutes instead of a half an hour, and we could begin the final panel then at around 4:15. Is that okay, or? Okay. I don't see so much opposition. So I think we're looking forward to that. So if you could, maybe my colleague Elvira could assist us with the PowerPoint. We just need to get that started. And then would you prefer to present from down there?
I can sit here if you don't mind just clicking through.
Excellent. So his stick, I think, is in there already. And that'll be, I think, a good way of including
I'll just say slide.
Excellent panel.
Being a professor myself, I'm always wary to be the one person standing between anyone in the room and a coffee break. So my apologies, and I'll try to go quick. The slides are already pulled up, so it's one of the screens already. I would just really quickly, Simon was much more eloquent than I can ever be regarding the responsibility to use terms and legal terms properly and not to get carried away. Gaddafi? No, the other one, I'm sorry.
It's open, I think it's down in the back.
I think that's incredibly important to use these terms responsibly. As the Prime Minister mentioned this morning, Ralph Lefkin spent his life goal to term genocide. It's an incredibly powerful word, and I think when people tend to throw this word around for headlines, I think it's very distracting and damaging, not only just for the term genocide, but I think it's an insult to all those people who suffered under genocide. And so I'd be very wary of throwing that word around loosely. On that note, since the focus of the panel is international institutions, I thought I'd put together a couple slides basically to talk a bit about the Libya case in Syria. Next slide, please. Next slide. A lot of people in many communities like to look at Libya and say, well, perhaps this is a precedent. Perhaps we can look at this and learn from it, maybe apply it. And I'd be cautious to do that because I think Libya is a very special case. Next slide. When you're looking at Syria, it's a very complex place, but I think there's a lot of differences between Syria, the leadership, and also the leadership in Libya and how it interacted with the rest of the world. Next slide. This guy was a very unique character. He had a practice of bad behavior. He funded terrorism around the world. He was alleged to help the IRA in its acts. He was behind, in many ways, the downing of Pan Am 103, which is the terrorist bombing case that took down an airplane over Lockerbie, Scotland, and actually served on the U.S. delegation to that trial in Holland. And I think when he decides to stand up and make indications of what's going to happen in Benghazi, it put the world on notice that someone who had a past bad behavior, past track record with terrorism, might be quite dangerous in his own population, which I think changed the perspective immensely. Next slide. So much so that it grabbed the UN's attention, and for any of us who've worked with the UN, we know that the UN is not always the most eager to jump into something, but it highlighted the concern for many people around the world, and so they decided to be actively involved and pass a number of UN resolutions. I think also what was unique in this case is you had members of the White House in the United States who worked in the Clinton administration and had lived through what happened in Bosnia and the Balkans. and had sworn to themselves that never again would this happen on their watch. And I think this motivated people immensely to be proactive, which is the reason I think you had so much support behind the resolutions for Libya. And indeed you had sanctions as well. Next slide. And unique in this case also was the fact that you had a referral to the International Criminal Court to investigate the matter. And I think that the fact that you had a world leader like Gaddafi who is being investigated by the ICC, which is a relatively new institution, raised the spectrum in terms of him being basically an outlaw, persona non grata for the world. And I think the fact that many governments decided to freeze his assets immediately changed the perspective in many ways. Next slide. I think also which is unique about Gaddafi was the way that his past behavior in supporting terrorism interacted with his role in the region. Next slide. In many ways, I think Gaddafi saw himself as a leader of Africa. And you can see this in terms of the funding he spent on many governments, and in fact his close relationships with many governments, some of whom were very late to freeze his assets, I think because of their personal relationships with Gaddafi. But I think that fact was interesting in terms of how he interacted with other international institutions. Next slide. One of the reasons he had a challenging relationship with some of his neighbors is because there are allegations that he tried to kill one of his neighbors. It was an assassination attempt. Indeed, this gives you a bad reputation, and one where when neighbors are likely to help other neighbors, they may be reluctant to do so, and I think that was the case with Gaddafi. Next slide. So much so that you had a regional body who decided to be proactive and actually to ask for the world support, ask for NATO support directly, and basically trying to resolve the situation. Next slide. And I think the fact that you have a regional body reaching out to another regional body, being NATO, provides excellent support and basically provides guidance and helps policymakers. And again, our colleague discussed the importance of political will and political decision-making. And having worked at the Pentagon and having gone to a number of NATO meetings myself, I can tell you that the fact that these institutions are able to work together is incredibly impressive. The fact that you had folks in Europe, folks in North America, the United States, and others who wanted to be active and had partners in the region were incredibly important. Next slide. So much so that you had folks in NATO working with United Arab Emirates and others to actually have combat missions, have combat support missions, and to be actively involved in this. I think changes the perspective immensely. Next slide. And I think when it comes back to it, just to kind of highlight the topic of this panel, is the fact that in many ways, in order to be responsive to the occurrences in the world, you have to work through international institutions. They are there for a reason. If we didn't have them, we'd have to recreate them. And so I'll simply leave in this note that it is a matter of political will. It is a matter of countries working with their populations, but it does so under the umbrella of international institutions, which is why I'm so glad this organization, this country, and everyone here today is focused on the role of how we collectively work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vlasic. Excellent way of concluding the panel. And no, I'd like to actually take this opportunity to request that you also join in expressing my gratitude to all of the speakers for, I think, a very interesting panel, a very thought-provoking panel. I saw there were even more hands that we didn't get to come to, so we'll have to come to them for the next panel. But I thought it was an excellent discussion on the role and responsibilities of global governance institutions to contribute to world peace. So please join in expressing our gratitude to all of the panelists, as well as the participants who participated in this discussion. Thank you.